Greetings and salutations, heroes of Vaultguard. Welcome. I am Yong Jeonsa, and this is a feedback video for Beta Dwarf to develop the tutorial of Vaultbreakers. I am very happy to know that Beta Dwarf will be prioritizing the new player experience as well as the tutorial for Vaultbreakers because I think it is extremely important for retaining new players. With that said, let us begin. The first thing I would like to suggest is that please make the entire tutorial be voice acted. If you have subtitles, that's okay, but please no text. If the player has to read text, then the player isn't going to read it. So please ensure that the entire tutorial is voice acted and not text. The next thing I would like to talk about is the early game experience of the new player from the tutorial itself. I haven't studied game development or anything like that, but this is just my observation and experience from being a gamer throughout my life. The window of opportunity to impress a gamer and to make them feel like your game is worth their time can be divided into three categories: the 10-minute mark, the 30-minute mark, and the 2-hour mark. The 10-minute mark and the 30-minute mark are very difficult to get correct. They're very difficult to pull off, but they are extremely crucial because if you do not pass these two categories, then you will lose the player. So why is the 10-minute mark so important? Well, as gamers, I'm sure many of them have had this experience where they installed a game, they fired it up, and within the first 10 minutes, they just quit and then they uninstalled. I've had this experience myself, and when I did have these experiences, I really questioned if I was actually a gamer. And after thinking about it, I really ended up at the conclusion that the first 10 minutes really didn't catch my interest. I didn't see anything that was making me curious, that made me want to explore the game more, so I just quit. Let's talk about the first category, which is the 10-minute mark. In the 10-minute mark, your goal is to impress the player and grab their attention. Grabbing their attention and piquing their interest is the goal of the 10-minute mark. So how do you do this? There are a few ways you can do this, and they are not limited to these ways, but these are just some of the ways that I have thought of that can help a game successfully grab the player's attention within the first 10 minutes. Start the game off with a cutscene, a really kick-ass cutscene. This cutscene is part of the main story and the lore of Vaultbreakers. Now, I don't know if you have the budget for a cutscene, but if you do, then please do invest in a very kick-ass cutscene. But if you don't, then that's okay. Maybe in the future you can add it down the line when budget and time allows it. So what kind of cutscene can you do? The cutscene should be directly linked to the main lore and story that's going on in the Vaultbreakers. This cutscene is the player's introduction into the world of Vaultbreakers to allow them to get an idea of what exactly is going on. It's supposed to pique their interest. Now, I don't have access to the lore of Vaultbreakers yet, so I can't make a story that's very lore accurate with the current lore, but an example I do have is in the cutscene, a massive war is going on. This is a war that's on World War levels. Every faction is fighting against each other. For example, the Scrats are one faction, so on and so forth. So everyone is fighting each other, and there is just massive chaos going on. There's just a lot of war, a lot of death. And while this is going on, elves come into focus, and the player learns that the elves are the pinnacle among all races in Vaultbreakers, and that the elves are actually the ones who were chosen by the ancient themselves to secure and guard the secrets of the vaults. All the knowledge and all the power that is within the vaults, the elves were the ones who were chosen to guard this, and therefore the elves also had the privilege of becoming the most advanced and powerful race in Vaultbreakers. I think the player also learned that the vaults were not only a place where the secrets and knowledge of the ancients as well as all the weapons and power was stored, but it was also a place that acted like a portal to a realm that was connecting the world of Vaultbreakers with the world of the ancients. This opens up opportunities for you to develop worlds outside of just the main world of Vaultbreakers in the future. And we see that the elves unleash the vaults and destroy them completely, releasing a massive surge of energy throughout the planet, causing complete chaos and plunging the world into a state that the world had never seen before. Now all the vault's energy has been unleashed. The weapons and the knowledge that was inside the vaults have now been scattered throughout the planet, causing not only the vaults to become unstable, but also changing the very face of the planet itself. When you show the elves unleashing the vaults, then please ensure that you design the elves in a very different way, because elves have been depicted in many stories and games throughout human history. So the elves should be designed in a way that makes them very unique in Vaultbreakers. This is your opportunity to show your talent and creativity when designing a character. So please ensure that the elves look absolutely amazing and very, very different, something the player has never seen before. The elves should also be depicted as a race which makes it very obvious to the player that this is a race that is the most superior in Vaultbreakers. So maybe they look very glamorous, maybe they look very divine, but throw in an element that gives it a small twist that makes the player think something's not right with these elves. For example, maybe you can make the elves extremely pale. Maybe their eyes are a little bit droopy and it seems like they're in a hypnosis. Maybe you can put in some very, very faint and light purple colored smoke in the background. Something like that, that makes the gamer think that something's not right with these elves. Like these elves, they certainly seem like they are the pinnacle of society, but there's also something off. I don't know what it is, but it seems like something is off. So make the player question that. Throw that element in there. The player really needs to question this part about the elves when they see the elves. After we show that this extreme calamity was released upon the realm while the war was going on and everyone was fighting, we show the player that survivors, or at least some of the survivors of this calamity, regardless of faction, decided to band together to create a shelter, a safe haven during these very harsh times. And this shelter is the base. Once you have taught the player what the base is, what the vendors do, and various features of the base, such as the target dummies, then I think it's a good time to teach the player how to move. That is, you move with WASD, etc. After this, I think it's a good idea to teach the player how to buy items. Make the player buy items that are crucial for every match. For example, you can make the player buy one harvesting item, specifically the item which is used to harvest plants, one bandage, and a gold bag. Do explain to the player what these items do. This is essentially the player's introduction into how to prepare for a match. Also, make the player buy a pair of boots and teach them how to equip these boots. Explain to them that even if they are going into the match completely naked, it's a good idea to at least have a pair of boots equipped on you simply for the movement speed, to be able to move around the map faster and get more things done quicker. By teaching the player how to equip items like boots, bandages, etc., you essentially teach them what the difference is between a storage and a loadout, the difference between gear slots, consumable slots, and inventory slots. Once you have taught the player what the base is and how to prepare for a match, now you teach them how to search for a match. Do explain to them that they will now be thrown into the tutorial version of Wolfswood and that they are completely safe and that they will not die, so they can take their time reading through any text they want and understanding the game at their own pace and that they are completely safe. This tutorial is a single player experience, so it is just the player and the NPCs. Therefore, if the player tries to go into an area that is not meant for the tutorial, the player should not be able to go there. Maybe you put up an invisible barrier or something, but essentially do not let the player go into areas that is not meant for the tutorial. The spawning area of the player in the tutorial map should be a place in Wolfswood that has some mobs around him so that you can teach him the basics of combat as soon as he spawns into the map. Once you have taught the player the basics of combat, for example, left click is your normal attack, and then you have 4 skills to use, one of which is your ultimate and is supposed to be your most powerful skills, and you teach them all that good stuff, then you give them their first objective, which is to kill the enemies that is in front of him. In this entire tutorial, the player should not die and the player should be aware of this. So maybe a mechanic you can put in is that every time the player reaches 50% health, the player will be automatically healed to 100% health. Once the player has killed the mobs, this is where you teach the player how to loot the mobs and explain to them that different mobs drop different types of loot. So if they are looking to farm a very specific type of material, then target farming mobs is a good idea. The loot that the player should receive from the mobs should be a combination of crafting materials and junk material so that you can teach the player the difference between the two and what they are used for. This will also help the player know that junk materials can be sold to vendors in their base. After this, teach the player how to open the map and then explain the map to the player, what the various icons on the map mean. This should be clear to the player before they actually start a PvP match. After this, you give the player their next objective, which is to travel to a teleportation shrine which will teleport them to Pinecrest Village. Do mark with a highlight on the map the teleportation shrine that they are supposed to travel to so that they know exactly which one they need to go to. Of course, they will not be able to venture into paths that's not intended for them, but it is still important to highlight this for them. On the player's journey to the teleportation shrine, it is important that the game gives the player a path in which they will have to use a combination of jump cacti, speed boost in order to get to the teleportation shrine, just so that the game can explain to the player how to use the jump cacti, how to use the speed boost, and what it is that these things actually do. On the player's journey to the teleportation shrine, make the player meet an enemy NPC hero. This is the game's opportunity to teach the player what the question mark with the colors mean. So what is a white question mark, what is a blue question mark, etc. The player should always win this fight, and the player should always be healed during this fight so that the player can read any text that they want and learn at their own pace. During this fight, please ensure that the player is not completely healed and that there is some amount, maybe 25% of their HP that still needs to be healed, just so that the player can be taught how to use a bandage and what it is the bandage actually does. And once you have taught them how to use the bandage, you teach the player how to loot an opposing player. In this loot, make the player find some gear and teach them how to equip it. Also make them find other items such as health potions which they can use to recover to full health, and as well as a zone scroll, the scrolls that we use to unlock zones that are currently locked. Yeah, give them one of those as well, because we will need this later down the tutorial to teach them how to use it and what it is for. Also, This is where you explain to the player that upon dying in a match, they lose everything except 50% of all crafting materials they currently have in their inventory. Once the player has reached the teleportation shrine, we teach them how to use a teleport shrine, and we teleport them to Pinecrest Village. Upon reaching Pinecrest Village, we make them harvest a few plants nearby that require the harvesting tool to actually collect the plants. After this, we teach the player how to open one of the normal doors that provides the player access to Pinecrest Village. After the player opens the door, this is where you can play another cutscene that ties in directly to the main story. For example, you can play a cutscene of the werewolf attack in Pinecrest Village. People are dying everywhere, people are jumping into wells because they don't know where they can run. Guards are maybe slaying werewolves, and while he's slaying it, another werewolf just like kills him from behind. Stuff like that, just like really cool cutscene. After the cutscene, we make the player fight some werewolves and harvest some of the normal plants in the field. This introduces the player to the difference between normal plants that do not require a tool to harvest and plants that require tools to harvest. This is also a good opportunity to explain to the player that certain areas are better for farming certain items. For example, in the Pinecrest Village fields, it's a really good place to farm those leaf items. I don't know what that leaf is called, but it's a good place to farm that leaf item. So we make the player farm some of the leaves in the field and explain to them how certain areas are better for farming certain items. Once the player has done this, we give the player their next objective, which is to open the main Pinecrest village with the scroll that they looted from the NPC player. After the player opens the door, then the player is shown the boss of Pinecrest Village. We explain the boss to the player. We explain the boss to the player as though the player is a person who is playing a video game for the very first time. So we explain from the very basics onwards. We explain that the boss is a much more powerful enemy than the enemies the player has fought so far, and how there are boss items that can help the player take down the boss, and how this boss in particular requires a very specific item before the player can even deal any damage to the boss. After this, we show the boss killing an allied NPC player. This is where we explain to the player how revive mechanics work and how much time they have before they can revive an ally or be revived themselves. Player is instructed and made to revive their allied NPC player, after which the next objective is given to them, which is to make their way to the hidden vendor in Pinecrest Village. This is where we explain to the player what a hidden vendor is and what their purposes are. Then we make the lightning storm approach the player. This is where we explain to the player how each map has its own unique mechanic, and in Wolfswood, the lightning storm is one of those unique mechanics. We explain to them what the storm is and how to avoid it, what's its purpose, etc. Then we start to make the map close out and explain to the player how every match lasts for only 15 minutes, and that at the 1 minute 40-second mark the storm will begin to close the map out. We explain to them how this mechanic actually works and what they need to do when this starts to happen. We then make the player open the map and show them which extraction point they need to go to. We make them go to a group extraction point. On the way, it should be a path that makes them go through a healing ball so that we can explain to them what the healing ball does and how to use it. Once this has happened, the player reaches the extraction point and we explain to them how an extraction point works, at which points in the game can they extract, and how to use the extraction. The player extracts and is taken back to base. Once the player has been taken back to base, we teach the player how to craft an item. And once the player has crafted an item, the player reaches the end of the tutorial. We reward the player with premium currency that is enough to buy one basic cosmetic item. This way, the tutorial doesn't feel like it was a waste of time and makes the player feel like it was worth the time invested in learning the game. I understand that this tutorial is very in-depth and detailed, but I am suggesting a very in-depth and detailed tutorial because in today's day and age, that is absolutely necessary. The tutorial is the first step of a new player's experience and therefore the first step to retaining a new player. I know in the past there have been many games, and even in the present there are many games with no tutorial or a lackluster tutorial. However, the days of when a game could succeed despite not having a good tutorial is long gone. That worked in like 2015, but that no longer works anymore. The window of opportunity a game has to entice a player and convince the player that the game is worth spending their time on has become much smaller than it was in 2015. I, as a gamer, have experienced this multiple times myself, where I have installed a game, I play it within the first 10 minutes, I am out. And that's not because I'm not a true gamer, it's just because the new player experience just really sucked. Therefore, I suggested the 10-minute mark, the 30-minute mark, and the 2-hour mark as categories for Beta Dwarf to specifically work on so that they can entice and impress the player. As a game development company, the company, what they're actually competing for is the player's time. Video games as an entertainment is an interactive entertainment experience. So people play it during their free time. And if in their free time they are spending it watching a movie or going through social media, then that is time they are not spending on your game. And you really, really need to impress the player and make them feel so much about the game that they decide to spend their free time on your game and not something else. So what you are actually competing for is the player's time. So make them feel like this game is worth their time. Such an in-depth tutorial not only helps people who are playing a video game for the very first time, but it also really helps those players who require a lot of guidance and handholding before they actually begin to be able to play the game at a decent skill level. Some people might say that Vaultbreakers isn't the kind of game they would recommend to someone who is playing a video game for the very first time, and I absolutely agree with them. However, you never know which game or what kind of game is going to be someone's very first video game. Growing up, I knew a lot of people whose first game was either Counter-Strike or Dota, and both of these games aren't by any means the kind of game a very new video game player should be playing, but it was nonetheless their very first video game, and from that point onwards they became gamers. Like, people go to their school, go to their university, and they're going to talk to other kids about this amazing game they are playing. Maybe they'll install it in the computers in the computer lab and play it over there, and it catches the attention of these other students and their interest is piqued, and then they try it out, and that's how people end up having their first video game be something that is absolutely not supposed to be a beginner's first video game. So you never know how or why your video game might be someone's very first video game. And as a game development company, I think it's an absolute honor if your game is someone's very first video game. Like, people may not remember the second game they played or the 100th game they played, but they always remember their very first video game. So make the tutorial very in-depth and detailed so that it not only helps a person who is playing a video game for the very first time, but also helps those players who require a lot of guidance and hand-holding before they begin to be able to play at a decent skill level. I hope Beta Dwarf found this feedback helpful and that the rest of you enjoyed it as well. If you did, then please leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel so that I can keep putting out better quality videos in the future. If you are interested in Vaultbreakers and signing up for the next playtest, which is on April 9th, then you can do so from their official website. Links will be in the description box below. Please check it out. And with that said, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.